Before we come to the main presenter today, let me just introduce Volker Heins to you, who holds a kind of double position. On one side, he is a member of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Bochum. On the other side, his second job is to be a senior fellow. I guess is most of his work. A senior fellow and head of the research unit of interculturality at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Essen, which is a kind of Institute for Advanced Studies in which three universities feed. So there's the University of Essen, Duisburg, which now used to be separate entities, one university, and then the University of Bochum. Before that, Volker was for a long time research fellow at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, also known as the Frankfurt School. And then, before that, a lecturer in political theory at McGill University in Montreal. In terms of publications, I think there are two books that really stand out. One is on the history and conceptualization of multiculturalism, which came out recently. And before that, Beyond Friend and Foe, the Politics of Critical Theory. Today, we have Volker here to talk about the new European narrative of Jürgen Habermas. And I'm looking forward to this talk. And the format is as usual, we hear about 45 minutes, plus maybe a few minutes more or less. And then have a general discussion and questions and answers.
Great. So thanks, Andreas. Thanks to you for coming. I'm not going to talk about the European Union itself or the crisis, but as Andreas mentioned, largely about Habermas' more recent European writings. So I'll talk about Europe only to the extent that it's a prominent subject in this well-known social political philosopher. And my initial claim would be that the current crisis of Europe is a multiple crisis, of course, and among other things, it's a crisis of its narratives, and thus a crisis of meaning, if you want. That's probably one of the few things I share with Habermas in the general diagnosis. So there's lots of work on the financial, the sovereign debt, and the institutional crisis of the European Union, and not so much work on what I would call the crisis of meaning. The deep crisis of the Union since 2008 has led to a number of major political transformations, as particularly in the island everybody knows. So there's an expansion of the competences of existing European institutions, the hurried creation of new institutions such as the European Stability Mechanism, major shifts in the political landscape of some member states, and heated protests of people who were hit hard by drastic austerity measures. Above all, we witness a situation in which large sections of the European population lose faith in the value and legitimacy of Europe. And this legitimacy crisis is different from and goes beyond older worries of what was rather euphemistically called democratic deficit. I think there's something more going on here. For example, opinion polls suggest that in France, the European Union is now even less popular than in Britain. In November 2013, only 34% of the French were unambiguously in favor of their country's membership in the European Union. 34%, and around 30% were just undecided, and maybe another 30% really against it. Throughout Europe, most people think that the Union is both intrusive and inefficient. I'm quoting from various opinion polls. In many countries, Brussels is even regarded as, that's another quote, as a foreign occupying power. That's a quote from a book by the Dutch political philosopher Luc van Middelaar, who also happens to be the speechwriter for Herman Van Rompuy, President of the European Council. And given this gloomy backdrop, it's no surprise that the intellectual defenders of the European project are also taking the floor to argue for their case. And Habermas is, at least on the continent, one of the most prominent ones. So Habermas' journalistic writings on the European crisis are a good example for the way defenders of the project argue and develop their case. His essays and comments show him as an international thinker in the footsteps of Immanuel Kant, but even more so as a skilled rhetorician who attempts to narrow the gap between theory and politics by means of a culturally effective narrative. This ambition to develop a kind of knowledge that becomes a part of the social world which it describes is of course hardwired into the very structure of Frankfurt-style critical theory. What is surprising is only that in recent times Habermas has taken the critical ambition much further by developing a theoretically grounded vision which directly addresses political leaders and calls them to action. For this reason, Habermas can also be read as interpreting the European crisis in terms of a Machiavellian moment, which according to John Pocock can mean two things. He came up with this book a long time ago. So I'm quoting from Pocock. The Machiavellian moment is the moment at which the formation or foundation of a republic appears possible, or the moment at which its formation is seen to be precarious and entail a crisis in the history to which it belongs, unquote. Presenting him as a democratic thinker of a new European state of exception, Habermas seems to play precisely on this twofold meaning of the current situation as both opportunity and danger. It's worth noting at the outset that Habermas' version of critical theory is not per se pro-European in the conventional sense. In fact, Habermas used to be quite skeptical about the dominant form of European unification. In the late 1970s, he insisted, for example, I give you a quote from an interview, "I've never been a fan of the idea of a unified Europe, even when it was fashionable, and I'm still not one today," unquote. So this Eurosceptic phase was rooted in belief that the process of European unification combines and compounds the twin evils of modern society: a deregulated market economy and a self-empowered bureaucracy. 10 years later, the early Euroscepticism gives way to increasing doubts about the problem-solving capacity of democratic nation-states as they are confronted with new global challenges and threats. The European institutions are increasingly seen as bulwarks against global neoliberalism and at the same time as instruments to regain the nation-states' lost capacity to correct unjust and harmful market outcomes. Now, at the turn of the century, Habermas went even further and displayed a genuine enthusiasm for the cause of the European Union. Now, it's Habermas himself who calls his recent essays a blueprint for, I quote, a convincing new narrative. So it's not that I'm the one who interprets his reading as a narrative. He's using this term. And one could say that, like all political narratives, this one also organizes meanings by way of emotionally powerful binary oppositions. So, for example, we have general populations versus elites, transnational democracy versus the nation state, Europe versus America, a couple of others. His first move is to jettison the old geocultural antithesis of Europe and Asia, or Islam maybe, that is still dominant in parts of conservative discourse to this day. This antithesis of Europe and Asia has deep roots in continental philosophy. Hegel, for example, maintained that the supposed lack of links of Asian nations to the sea and by contrast the openness of Europeans towards the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea had created, I'm quoting Hegel only once, an enduring difference between the two continents, unquote. So Habermas gets rid of this essentializing dichotomy and focuses instead on the difference between models of political order. The implication is that the constitutive binary of insiders and outsiders, which corresponds to a moral binary of superior and inferior, is now applied to political positions inside European member states. Habermas is, for example, vigorously rejected, if only in private, Scottish aspirations for independence as backward recently, not published in English so far. Until the turn of the century, Habermas talks about the need and the wisdom of overcoming the nation state by what he used to call a European federal state. There's also some mentioning of the Federal Republic of European States in his book Between Facts and Norms and in various other writings. Accordingly, the goal is to confer upon the institutions of the European Union, regardless of the diversity of regional cultures of its member states, the character of an authentic state. That's also a quote. So that was the idea, to turn the European institutions into a proper state. In order to become more like a state, the EU needs its own army, a constitution, the ability to raise taxes on its own, a convergence of tax rates and social policies across the member states, a common foreign policy, and an elected president. I've gathered all these hints from various writings. In addition, the European anthem should be played more often, and its blue flag with the circle of stars should be more visible. All of these hints indicate that until recently, Habermas wanted the European Union to move towards a large-scale replica of the nation-state, minus linguistic and ethnic homogeneity. The absence of a European people or even a shared political culture are not seen as unsurmountable problems because a suitable ethical basis of the European superstate could be created ex post facto by the emergent state itself. That's what he thought until a couple of years ago. Habermas reminds his readers of the history of European nation states, in which national consciousness and civic solidarity, and I quote from an older text published in 1999, in which national consciousness and civic solidarity were produced only gradually with the help of national historiography, mass communication, and universal conscription, unquote. Euro-federalists have thus no reason to succumb to defeatism, his words. At this stage, Habermas believes that Germans, French, and Britons could be turned into Europeans the same way the French central state turned peasants into Frenchmen, to quote the famous book by Eugene Weber. This linear conception of historical progress, which assumes that the civic consciousness and solidarity can be upscaled from local to national and from national to European formats, is at odds with Habermas's cosmopolitan aspirations. Why should the artificial generation of a new sense of togetherness come to a final halt at the borders of Europe? That's the first thing that comes to mind. Also, a European federal state would likely turn out to be just another particularistic global player in international politics. Particularistic is one of his favorite terms, of course. So just another power bloc alongside the United States, China, and other powers. But if the final goal of history is the establishment of what he calls the global domestic politics without a world government, then it's not clear how the European Union, after having been transformed into a genuine state, could be a meaningful step in this direction, as it would be just another great power. In addition, Habermas' older narrative of progress invites the same kind of critique he developed against Charles Taylor's idea of multiculturalism. In Taylor's understanding, what distinguishes policies of recognition towards cultural minorities is, and I'm quoting Taylor, that they actively seek to create members of the community, unquote. It is not enough, for example, to protect a minority language. One must also make sure that future generations can identify with a certain culture. In his well-known critique, Habermas misread, as I would see it, and rejected this conception of minority rights as the political equivalent to biological species protection. This critique in turn reiterated the assimilationist argument of the Austro-Marxist Otto Bauer against Orthodox Jews who were denounced before the First World War for founding their own schools in order to promote, and I quote Otto Bauer, the artificial preservation of their old cultural specificity. That's the book on the question of nationalities and social democracy. And Otto Bauer, of course, preferred the Jewish minority in Austria to blend in with mainstream society. So in a way, like most of the debates we are having, they've already been fought some time ago. And my point here is that until about maybe 10-15 years ago, Habermas himself was not immune against the analogous charge of advocating the gradual imposition of a European identity through cultural engineering. I'm a bit mean here, but that's actually what it's about. And in this, he was advocating the assimilationist techniques of 19th century nationalism, which until the fall of the Berlin Wall, both the European Commission and the Parliament hoped to employ on the diverse populations of Europe. So it's quite interesting that, and probably forgotten by now, that European institutions tried to, or actually they commissioned the writing of uniform history textbooks for a while, or the production of identical transnational radio and television broadcasts. So these puny attempts at orchestrating the formation of a common identity were poorly received by the public, to say the least, and not only Britain. They also failed because authors from different countries would not agree whether, for example, Sir Francis Drake was a pirate or maybe a hero, or whether Kafka was a Czech or a German, as I believe strongly, not to mention other more substantive matters of historical dispute. So it's actually quite interesting to look at the history of these common textbooks. You can imagine, I think, in Ireland, there's some dissensions which cannot easily be solved by just setting up a commission. Now, moving on, Habermas' texts, that's probably one of the best things one could say about those texts. They relate to and take in those experiences of defeat, so things that did not work. So Operation Nation State cannot be replicated at a different level, just by a small elite. And he's realizing this. So he's telling a more complex story, in particular since the onset of the Euro crisis. And he's actually starting with a new pair of opposites. So the ideal is no longer a federal superstate. And he's also given up on the notion of a homogeneous European culture, a term which, by the way, has been eliminated from official European Union documents after the Treaty of Maastricht. It's no longer part of the language of the European Union, no longer European culture. this has been dropped. Today, Habermas regards the alternative between nation-state and the European federal state as false and, as he's putting it, hopeless. And he's also giving up on the analogy between European and US constitutional history, which he calls misleading, this analogy. So the imagined or envisioned highest stage of European integration is not a state anymore, but a supranational federation, and I quote, that does not acquire a state-like character. I won't go too deep into the details of this model here, just to make this difference clear as he sees it. So Europe, in his view, transcends the nation-state by shedding both its national content and the state form. For Habermas, this is possible to the extent to which the making and the enforcement of European law are distributed vertically at different levels within a single system of governance, as it, according to him, is already emerging in Europe. So he hopes for the completion of a fully autonomous supranational body of institutions in charge of lawmaking and adjudication, which would obligate the executives and courts of the member states to apply and enforce those laws. And another thing is that on Habermas's view, this vertical distribution of sovereignty away from its concentration at the top level of nation states can be considered what he calls explicitly a model to be emulated by other continents and ultimately the world community as such. So the idea is that now he claims to have resolved this tension, since the European Union is no longer envisioned as a state, it can actually become a model for the entire world, basically, for a new reform of the United Nations and so on. In the same movement, two other models of political order are rejected. First, the continental federal state along US lines, and then what he's calling the post-democratic executive federalism. You might have heard this term. That's what we have now, post-democratic executive federalism, which materialized in the course of the crisis as a result of political, administrative elites colluding to form a regime of austerity largely unaccountable to the public. Executive federalism is a form of transnational exercise of power which delegitimizes democratic control by claiming that the current situation of crisis does not need politics in any but a managerial sense. That would be my definition. So a simple binary of two opposing terms, nation-state versus federal state, is supplanted by a constellation that could be represented as something like a symbiotic square. So it's we have now four political animals here: nation-state, the federal state, and then bureaucratic executive federation, and the federal, transnational democracy, the nation-state, the federal state, and executive federalism. Is this form? I believe so. And what's interesting here, or maybe interesting, is that this reformulation of the European ideal seems to reconcile widely separated options, such as this new transnational federation and the nation-state. So Habermas, since a couple of years, he has actually a place for the nation-state, so this a subaltern place. So it's no longer about just overcoming the nation-state and destroying the sovereignty of its member states, but it's a more complex constellation. For example, he insists, and I give you a quote, that the citizens of the Union have a justified interest in their respective nation states continuing to perform their proven role as guarantors of law and freedom, also in their role of member states. The nation states are more than just embodiments of national cultures worthy of preservation. They vouch for a level of justice and freedom which citizens rightly want to see preserved. So that's quite different from what he wrote 20 years ago, where the nation state was basically anachronistic, real but anachronistic and to be overcome. So the nation state is not completely rejected. What is completely rejected is executive federalism of the Eurozone governments and anything that looks like the United States of Europe. So this idea is also given up. So Habermas's new European narrative is sort of flexible and does not harden into something like a narrative shield, completely immune to historical experiences. Rather, the narrative offers connections to a variety of perceptions and interpretations present in the public sphere. Within the master plot of an ascending movement towards unified Europe, there are ambiguities and room for interpretation that are meant to appeal, in particular, to the defenders of the nation state. Now, in all this, Habermas is, that's no surprise to you, is pretty much a disciple of some of Kant's social political writings. So his Habermas's post-national democracy looks pretty much like Kant's international federation. And in both cases, we see an rather odd combination of idealism and realism. So on a number of occasions in his writings, Kant argues that the harsh experiences people are bound to make because of their natural selfishness pave the way for the perpetual peace of the international federation of the future. Reason offers a highway to this future, but on the beaten track of experience, humankind will arrive at the same conclusion. I give you a quote by Kant in the Idea of Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Purpose, where he says, "Wars, tense and unremitting military preparations, and the resultant distress which every state must eventually feel within itself, even in the midst of peace, these are the means by which nature drives nations to make initially imperfect attempts, but finally, after many devastations, upheavals, and even complete inner exhaustion of their powers, to take the step which reason could have suggested to them even without so many sad experiences, that of abandoning a lawless state of savagery and entering a federation of peoples." In other words, if you don't listen to the philosophers, find out the hard way. Okay? In Habermas, we find the same argument that sad collective experiences are an unnecessary detour to insights that reason already holds in store for us. The treaty system of the European Union, in particular the Lisbon Treaty, as well as the capacity of Parliament and Commission to speak and act on behalf of Europe, is considered non-negotiable. With this body of institutions firmly in place, the third component, as he calls it, solidarity among citizens who are willing to support each other, and I'm quoting, should expand to keep pace with it, as it were. Now the expression expanding to keep pace suggests that the meanings created and shared by citizens are only something like an add-on to the already existing organizational core of the Union. In developing his argument, Habermas makes it clear that the answer to the question whether civil society catches up with the imperatives of European integration, and I quote, depends on learning processes which, as the current crisis leads us to hope, can be stimulated by perceptions of economic and political constraints, unquote. I think this is fairly close to what Kant said 200 years ago. The institutions are already there, and the force of the crisis motivates citizens to accept these institutions and fill them with life, as he puts it at one point. Here too, the subordinate and only supplementary role of collective meaning-making becomes obvious. Democratic contestation, public debate, and the force of the better argument, which has been invoked by many scholars, are replaced by a belief in the educational power of the constraints created by the crisis. This last point deserves just a little elaboration, for Habermas, again like Kant, does not expect the transnational European democracy to arise without the initiative and rhetorical power of what Kant called a moral politician. A new leadership must seize the historical moment and precipitate a breakthrough after convincing the public of the state of exception we live in. Here's a quote, a more recent quote by Habermas. The economically generated apprehensions are inspiring a more acute popular awareness of the problems besetting Europe and are lending them greater existential significance than ever before. The political elites should embrace this unusual boost in public prominence of the issues as an opportunity and also regard it as a reflection of the extraordinary nature of the current situation. But the politicians have also long since become a functional elite. They are no longer prepared for a situation in which the established boundaries have shifted, one which cannot be mastered by established administrative mechanisms and opinion polls, but instead calls for a new mode of politics capable of transforming mentalities. And I can assure you, in German it sounds even more dramatic. So this is where Habermas comes closest to, what we might call a Machiavellian interpretation of the present situation. Europe is faltering because there's no new class of princes, if it is as it were, who are simultaneously innovators, that's another term Machiavelli is actually using, innovators able and willing to take extraordinary risks and change old institutions into new ones. Of course, we may wonder whether the problem is actually that the governments of the European Union are lacking simply what he calls the necessary courage to realize the European dream. Maybe there are also some actually structural problems that cannot just be solved by a new elite. Now, how much time do I have left?
10 minutes.
Okay. Now I think what's interesting is that this narrative, which I've just briefly sketched, is not shared by and does not resonate with large sections of the public, not even in Germany, by the way, or elsewhere in Europe. And it's interesting, and maybe that's also something we can discuss, why is that? And I think there are certainly at least 3 reasons why we're talking about a failing narrative. So one is that Habermas's vision consists of two incompatible components, as I see it. So on the one hand, he defends the core of the current European institutions very much, and he's confining his critique to suggestions about how to rebalance those various institutions. And then, of course, he's asking for the transfer of more resources and more power to the European institutions. On the other hand, he insists very strongly on what he calls a change of the political mode of procedure of the European Union. So he's very much in favor of radically democratizing the European Union. He has asked for referendums, and very recently he also made a couple of rather astonishing comments on elections and the rise of populist parties throughout Europe. So I give you a quote from an interview he recently gave to a German newspaper. Here's what Habermas is saying. I take it as a good thing that the opponents of Europe have found a forum in which they are bringing before the eyes of the political elites the necessity of finally bringing the population itself into the process of unification. Right-wing populism requires the adjustment of the elite mode up until now on the participation of the citizens. That can only do good for the European Parliament and European lawmaking. So he's actually saying, all these, for many quite alarming trends can be positive because this sort of ferocious populism might force politicians to change their way. And as I said, I think the problem is that these components, the democratization of the Union and the transfer of more and more sovereign authority at the European level, are plainly incompatible. Taken by itself, each component is plausible and attractive to large sections of the public. That is true for the call for democratic self-rule and more democratic rights, as well as for the call for stronger European institutions. This last demand has recently been articulated, for example, by the German finance minister, I'm sure you know his name, Wolfgang Schäuble, who, like Habermas, has called for a genuine European government, which is described as the outcome of a coming, these are the words of Schäuble, a true revolution. It's an interview he gave to the French paper Le Monde. And Habermas now is not simply siding with Schäuble, but he's, as I said, he's combining these two incompatible claims. Yes, we want a strengthening of the European Union, at the same time more democracy. That's the first thing I think we can discuss. Second, his recent Schadenfreude about the victory of right-wing populist parties is one thing, but he's still very much detached. He's not really considering or studying real interests or motives of citizens in various countries of the European Union, as I see it. Also, his narrative, if you look at how it's unfolding over the years, they're no longer, usually a good narrative needs, some heroes and some villains and some obstacles to overcome, but here it's more and more only villains, So he's saying, for a long time it was basically European governments, particularly the German one and a couple of others, Brits, of course, and others. Now it's more and more all governments are bad. And also, the populations are rather, lazy and fearful or even separatist. And recently he said that there's no longer any European movement from below on the horizon. So rather pessimistic statements from his own point of view. He's also saying that Germany, unfortunately, has become a normal nation state and has lost its moral sway. So it's basically behaving like any other state in Europe, which is bad news for him. So that's about the structure of the narratives. And third, I think the narrative fails because Habermas cannot give a convincing new answer to the old question of the purpose of a further deepening of the European. I mean, if we follow him up to this point, at some point we should ask them, why should we actually move on, and where to? And I believe that only such an answer, such a new answer, would galvanize the public and form the equivalent to something like people rising up, for something that really makes a lot of sense. And historically, as you certainly know, the question of the purpose of European unification has been answered in two different ways. Either Europe was seen as a peace project, in the tradition of Rousseau and Kant and many others. And here the idea was to overcome nationalism, to break the sovereignty of states as a first step towards world peace. And according to some opinion polls, that's still a very, very popular idea. So 70 to 80% of citizens throughout Europe think that's actually one of the great achievements. I think we can all agree. But peace, in my mind, in Europe, no longer justifies a further deepening of European integration. Quite the contrary, probably. I mean, recent steps have rather alienated, various nations from each other. So I think that's not a good suggestion. Peace won't become more stable, just by having more power and transferred to Brussels. So, and then second, apart from peace project, was Europe as a power project. This was about fusing the nation states into a larger whole, combining their power to improve the position of Europe vis-à-vis other world powers. And that's also one undertow in many of Habermas's writings. So the first vision is about morality and the second about identity and power. The first is rather idealistic, the other is rather realistic. And beyond, and that was one thing I was looking for. Is there anything beyond these two projects? And the one hint I found is the following one. So recently, Habermas has argued that the completion of a political union is, and I quote, necessary if the national diversity and the incomparable cultural wealth of the biotope, old Europe, are to enjoy any protection against becoming leveled in the midst of rapidly progressing globalization, unquote. Okay? So the idea is that's different. So it's about protecting old Europe, its national diversity, its cultural richness against globalization. I think that's different from the peace and power projects. Now, maybe this rings a bell, because this is actually the old conservationist analogy, which reminds us once more of Habermas's critique of Taylor's multiculturalism. And he rejected that because he said there's no way of basically establishing an administrative guarantee of certain threatened ways of life. So we are again back to this line of argument. The problem is also that, in my view, here Habermas appeals to emotions that are quite unlikely to help the case of the European Union. So probably there are other forces in society that can use the same narrative for very different purposes. And at this point, I want to thank you. Looking forward to the discussion.
Well, yes, please feel free to ask Volker anything you want to ask.
Simple question.
Okay.
Who reads Habermas today? Who's his audience when he's writing these pieces, or when somebody is phoning up and say, I'd like to do an interview piece? Who's the imagined audience? Who is it being told? Is it university students? Is it professors of philosophy? Is it who's his audience? Does he have any recognition outside of
academia?
Yeah, or what kind of recognition? I don't know.
I mean, this of course probably depends on the country we look at.
In Germany.
In Germany.
At home, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some of those quotes I gave you are from high quality daily papers. So he's certainly seeking a very broad audience. I think I said that I think it's failing really to catch on, but he's widely published, and I don't know exactly, how. I mean, it's probably lots of people read this. A different question would be how many really take this seriously and follow his advice. So he's a member of the Social Democratic Party, and it's quite obvious that there are not many followers, at least among the party leadership, for reasons we could discuss. But I think that's a very valid question.
Another way of rephrasing it, is he more a kind of a mascot? He's a philosopher who's on our side, or has he become a resource that you can mobilize him, so his arguments can be picked over, and then you find he made an argument here, more powers to the European Union, you can see the Eurocrats rubbing their hands, and they can wheel out Jürgen Habermas and say this great world-famous philosopher is supporting our view, or blah, blah, blah. Is that how he's used, or how he's appreciated, or?
I don't think that would be the case because of those two components I quoted, So on the one hand he's saying, yes, more power, that's the main discrepancy here, Yes, more power to Brussels, and certain people say, oh yeah, great. But then he's saying, actually UKIP is not that bad either, because it's actually the people speaking up, and maybe with more democracy, these ugly phenomena will disappear, but we have and that, he's not really, it's a narrative, and he's not really offering us arguments, why this should happen, why this is a likely outcome, of a further rise of, right-wing populist parties. It's rather counterintuitive to me, at least, that this would help the cause of a better European Union. Yeah, but I mean, for Germany, I could certainly say, all these, the way he's phrasing things, it's much quoted. I think many people would be able to give you certain lines, in these writings.
Thank you.
I was interested to note that the market project was not included in the 2 or 3 that you listed. Because clearly the market is the one that's seen as the basis of European integration for the most part now, but also as one of the problems. And I was also interested to note that while you focus on the institution building of the European Union, you didn't focus on the ideological underpinning of it at present, which I see as a form of neoliberal populism, in which the political and economic elite don't want to change the economic policies which enrich those at the top and impoverish those at the bottom, and don't create a middle class, but they're quite willing to use arguments against migrants, against ethnic minorities, and the populism that arises as a result of those policies, because they deflect from the austerity and the neoliberal policies that they wanted to continue to implement. So it seemed to me that a counter narrative would have to address those concerns, as opposed to the institution building, which he seems to have focused on.
Of course, what he calls market Europe and neoliberalism figures prominently in his text. I was just referring to, the dominant paradigms of the past, how the European project has been justified, by those founding figures, Jean Monnet and others. But you're right, I mean, I mean, there was always a mentioning of prosperity, you know. So we could probably say peace, power, and then prosperity. And of course, some neoliberals would argue, okay, that's what, you know, through neoliberalism we have a prospering region, and we don't need those we don't need a strong superstructure, just a bit of superstructure to regulate certain unjustified market outcomes. Yeah. So here I was just talking about the positive ideals, you know, and I find it really interesting and will look for more hints that he's developing. There were a few hints in this book, The Divided West. There's also, you know, sometimes he's mentioning this thing about defending Europe against globalization, which is kind of odd, you know, because it can also be interpreted as a fairly conservative trend, which is fine with me. It's not really in line with other things he's saying, you know. This very defensive outlook, you know. And in particular when he's mentioning national diversity and the culture and these things. So, yeah.
Well, nobody has one. I have one for you.
Okay, good.
So at least you can still think about maybe other questions in the meantime. So there's this argument that was made by Perry Anderson, where he said, well, if you take a closer look at his writings, Habermas's writings actually appears rather parochial. So in the last book, he does then a citation count, so 80% of the sources are from German sources, and then the rest, a few friends that have been supporters of the project of the Frankfurt School since day one, and a few assistants, and that's about it. So you think, well, you know, I mean, we teach our students, you know, to have a broad base on which to make a certain claim or an argument. So, you know, the kind of global thinker that he pretends to be looks actually rather peculiarly German and provincial in this sort of thing.
I mean, this is an interesting observation, certainly. And it's true, I think it's an interesting way of reading a text, you know, I mean, whom is he quoting and where are those people from? And who owes his or her job to Habermas himself, you know, these kind of things. And it's of course ironic, and it has been, in other contexts, it's also been observed that, I mean, Germans are very much in favor of the European Union, of strengthening European institutions. There's a Pew Research report quite recently, so if you look at support for European institutions, the highest percentage you get in Poland, but they are not a member of the Eurozone, and the second highest in Germany. And then it goes all the way down, Ireland is not even mentioned. But probably it's also fairly high, I don't know. But France, UK, Spain, Italy, Greece, of course, you know, tiny minorities actually in favor of this system. So you could say that's probably, and it should be reflected upon. And some German sociologists did this. Hans Joas, for example, he has this remark, you know, if there's this guy who says like, you know, I'm not really German, you know, I'm rather European, you know, you can tell him, oh, he's German. You know, because everybody else will say, okay, I'm British, I'm French, you know. So if somebody says like, you know, I'm really in favor of Europe. So he's part of this, and he's totally unironic about this way of, he's not aware maybe of, maybe he's not talking to enough people about these things. So he does not, in fact, he does not quote many different views. Is that your answer?
Okay, we can come back to that later.
Question. So when I was listening to you quote Habermas and discuss the political and economic elite of Europe, almost as, you know, where is the Machiavellian innovation to turn around the crisis into a way of strengthening the European project? But you only referred, or perhaps you quoted Habermas as only referring to the political and administrative elite, but surely to go even further than Habermas, the real Machiavellian, you know, turn would be to recognise that the real power leaders are business and major business corporations. And so really probably Habermas has failed to actually recognise that. And and the European project itself has already recognised through their various forms of multi-level governance and partnership governance, where they bring on board, and very blatantly bring them on board. And so they deny populist democracy, and they deny, what we would assume as democratic processes, and they openly say, we will make policy, first of all, by bringing into our offices on a regular basis these major corporations. The whole discussion around, for example, legislation around the internet and the provision of data through the internet. This legislation has been written hand in hand with the major corporations who pervade this data and sell this data as part of their market product. It has not paid attention to the needs of the citizen. And so if Habermas really wants to claim that there should be a Machiavellian approach to saving Europe, then he has missed the key players, it seems.
That's true. He's actually, I could have given this talk also at a real science department, obviously, and other departments, philosophy, And it's interesting, there's, maybe I should have mentioned, maybe you know that, he used to be a professor, he had dual tenure in Frankfurt, so both in philosophy and sociology, but there's very little sociology. This is a paper I'm still writing, obviously, and there are two bodies of sociological literature I'm interested in, unlike Habermas. And one is about what you have mentioned, so there's quite some empirical research on how globalization or the European Union or so-called denationalization divides elites and citizens. And I've come across a recent comparative research project that actually argues along your lines that there is in fact a social basis for European integration as it works now. So it's not just about a tiny political elite and some brainwashed citizens, and it's more complicated. And we know from research that political elites do not differ from those elites you have mentioned and a couple of others. And so it's wrong to suggest, as Habermas does, that it's only about politicians and their lack of courage and these kind of things, which is Machiavellian in a very narrow way. It's a bit of a caricature, Machiavelli. So you need this new prince, which again is in many ways an odd statement, I think. But, so that's something he's not addressing. And the second body of empirical sociological literature, and here I would also maybe get some more hints from you and others, is about the reality of transnational identities and the assumption that in contemporary society there's this process of uprooting individuals and of forming new identities. There's some research on this as well. So recently I saw a study about this supposedly highly mobile middle class, and it's interesting if you look at their patterns and dynamics of mobility and also belonging, they're surprisingly conservative. So to put it simply, I think Habermas overestimates the extent to which people actually build transnational identities and are globally mobile, or the implications that would have. So that would be something, it's not really a super strong argument, but I think it's something that's often not in the picture.
What I'm saying is that actually he would strengthen his argument if he did some empirical research. Because you'd find, oh wow, they really are Machiavellian, they really have turned
he would strengthen it, but he would also make it more, it would become more complicated, because there's evidence that large parts of the general population are highly skeptical and they feel threatened, these kind of things. That would be the task of building maybe a more democratic, more cosmopolitan and more realist narrative at the same time. But probably there are trade-offs between these three goals. that would be, I mean, I should probably say a bit more about this also. How should an alternative, how would it look like?
Just a comment is to do with this idea of Habermas as imagining a politician, and I've struck more and more what you're saying that Habermas at the moment almost seems to be like 100 years on. This is Max Weber Habermas is in the European crisis, and Max Weber is writing in Politics as Vocation in the middle of World War I with the German state, the Germans losing the war and the German state going down. And he has a similar kind of reflection that we really need these new politicians, but what we need is some kind of a superhero politician who has the Machiavellian will to grab the situation by the throat and turn it around. Except in one case it's the German nation and the German state in the case of Weber, and it's the European institutions and this European quasi-supernation that Habermas has an emotional attachment.
That's interesting. I never thought about it. You know, what was on my mind was also Carl Schmitt. You know, because he's actually really close. I mean, I use this term state of exception. He's not using it, but he's very close. You know, and actually Ulrich Beck, another German sociologist, he's quoting Carl Schmitt. But I didn't want to mention that.
Yeah, well, I was just trying to think of what Machiavellian moments the European elite could undertake in this crisis. And in fact, they have actually undertaken one, which was the financial transactions tax, which was supported by about 80% of the European population, and probably, from their point of view, reflected, first of all, an attempt to get independent tax-raising powers, but secondly, probably to make some gesture to the population in terms of the bank bailouts and so on. But the interesting thing about it has been a spectacular failure. In other words, even when you do get to the sort of, and the Commission did, I mean, I'm not a supporter of the Commission, but I mean, they did actually fight for this particular tax. But in fact, it was a spectacular failure. So even if you had your superhero who's going to try to appeal to the population to create a different type of Europe, there are huge structural obstacles in carrying it through, as this particular case indicates.
That's very true. So it's not about just appealing to a bunch of politicians. There are things, and there was this other, I mean, just since, quoting a couple of German authors, there's a book coming out very soon by Klaus Offe, who wrote, it's called Europe Entrapped, published by Polity Press. And he has this comment, I don't find it at the moment, that he's basically saying, what needs to be done is impossible to do. He's saying, we should think about like really fair burden sharing and fiscal union, all these things, but it's totally unfeasible unless you give up on democracy. That's again my argument about the two incompatible components, and often it's describing it much better. So it's a huge dilemma. So fiscal union is, I mean, Germany will probably leave the Eurozone. So, and it's impossible. There are also quite interesting data, by the way, on this. I mean, there's no government. It's not a matter of courage. You would have to be suicidal, if you suggest something in a country like Germany or Netherlands, some of the smaller countries. So,
Or Habermas might respond, we need even a bigger crisis than we already face, a really massive crisis in order to have the space for the superhero to come in.
Yeah, I'm feeling quite uneasy about this.
We're all feeling quite uneasy.
Also the allusion to Weber, I mean, there was this very prophetic tone, he knew how bad things would become, in a way.
Yeah, I'm interested in that point you made about kind of an executive now within Europe making decisions for all of Europe, and it would be, we've a kind of a smaller scale of that in Ireland within our executive, within our parliament. So we've a four-person executive that seems to make most of the policies. But it seems as, is the European Union experiment almost like a stalled revolution, that in the way it's stalled, it's actually preventing, say, policy change or national movements in Ireland from developing themselves, because it's still very much tied to policies that are occurring still in Europe. So that this stalling seems to happen because you have to negotiate with, the national, your national government, the European adventure, and kind of international finance and business. Because Ireland seems very much, it's like, where do we look to? Is it policies we maintain at home? The idea of cheap finance that led us into the crisis that we were. At the same time, the ECB conversation that's gone on about was there force. And then Irish people themselves, who I think are very pro-European, and were quite relieved, I think, when the ECB did come in initially. But I'd say Ireland's a little bit lost as a population as where do we look to within this experiment.
Mm. Yeah,
So is it stalled in a way?
Yeah, but then again, we can ask, how will things look like in 10 years? And no idea.
On a more positive note, when you actually look at the social reality of Europe, the European Union produces incredible data about the opinions, but also the numbers of people living in different countries. There's more immigrants within Europe, in other European countries than ever before. The Socrates/Erasmus programs and the other mobility programs have been highly successful in terms of even things like intermarriages and children, and support for European identity added to national identity is still fairly robust. So there's a counteracting or countervailing social reality of people's lived Europeanness that's still there, and in fact I think it's becoming more embedded over time, despite all these negative trends we've been talking about now.
But my own wonder is how much mobility equals good and migrant equals bad, even when they're the same people. And that if you look at, for instance, the Horizons 2020 call, you could just replace French nationalism, German nationalism, Irish nationalism with European nationalism. Something was all fine. But I know in my own field, in the discourse about the European city means not the American city, but it also means not anything to do with the Turkish city, the Indian city, the Chinese city, and it's can be extremely negative about both. We're the ones who do it right. Interestingly enough, the European city discourse is almost only a German-speaking discourse. You don't see it in France, you don't see it here, even when they're mostly Italian paradigms originally are applied. It's only called the European city discourse in the German-speaking world.
The study I mentioned about rootedness of mobile middle-class people, that was done in places like Lyon and some French and Spanish cities where you can, and the result was, people have strong local attachment, in spite of, flying business class all the time and being super mobile, something that's maybe not an argument against anything, but I think Habermas tends to believe that there's this linear process, people shed their old particularistic identities in favor of more universalistic, and the reality is much more complex, obviously, and more contradictory. Yeah, maybe just one thing, because I checked the figures, when you give a talk, look like at the data, and it would be interesting about Ireland, which is, for various reasons, both strongly attached, I believe, to the country, but also very mobile, historically, and I don't know how many people currently are holding Irish passports and live in other countries of the European Union, probably quite a lot, I suppose.
But even more than elsewhere.
Elsewhere, yeah, from the US and other countries. And in Germany, it's 5% of citizens say that they have lived in another EU country. 5%. I don't know whether this is a lot or not.
In Ireland, it's maybe around between 15 and 20% of people born in Ireland who don't live in Ireland.
Yeah.
Depends on what time frame. So, and I think Ireland would have one of the highest rates
in Europe?
So in Germany, it's, and it would be interesting to look at.
Jerry, that would even be higher if it was the question, have lived. In
Yeah,
other words,
yeah, I
like
know,
somebody who's here.
Yeah, yeah.
and
have lived.
much, much higher.
So 5% doesn't strike me as a very high number.
Okay.
No.
And of course, you know, Germans are traveling a lot as tourists, and maybe also take part in these exchange programs. And but it's 5%, and actually the same percentage as non-European, particularly the United States and other countries. That's also what I briefly mentioned. You know, so one problem with Habermas is, you know, why, I mean, this transnationalization of you know, so our sense of belonging. Why limit it to the European Union? Why not go global? You know, and that's also happening a lot. You know.
But even on this point of movement of labour, I mean, those figures are actually very small. So the idea of the free movement of labour in Europe actually doesn't transpire as being something that a lot of people take up on, and it's probably more external migrants coming into Europe who move around more.
And that was the more, you know, the theoretical, I think that was almost an argument I made, you know, saying, you know, Habermas has this strange idea of, you know, what he used to call the system, basically, like institutions. They are in place. And then he has this idea that, you know, the life world and meaning-making and democracy follow suit, you know. Whereas I think it would be more coherent to say that these are independent logics, you know. And that people link up with people all over the world, you know. Why not with Norway? It's not part of the European Union, and even when Britain leaves the European Union, we'll still be friends. There's much more exchange going on between Britain and Germany than between Greece and Germany, for example, as you probably know. So.
Okay, on that note, I mean, for those interested who want to continue with the debate, we can always go together to the common room. Unfortunately, there's no budget to invite people for, you know, you have to pay for your yes, don't worry. But so please, we're going on the common room. If you want to join us, please do so. And thanks again for.